In today's session, let's try to understand what are the major differences between centralized version control system and distributed version control system, which we technically call it as CVCS and DVCS. First, let us talk about CVCS. If you look at this particular diagram, the concept is you have a developers in your team working for the software development. Now, what they will do? First, they have to create a repository in the centralized server where the entire code will get stored here. Now, me as a developer, I have to download the copy. I will not have the entire history of the development. What are the changes I want to do? That particular copy will get created here. And I will do my changes. Once my changes have been done, I will commit my changes to the centralized repository. Which means if I need to perform any action on the repository, it has to communicate over the network. Because you don't have a local copy of the entire history of the repository. That is the reason why if you do any changes and if you try to run any actions, those actions should be executed by trying to communicate to the remote repository, which will consume lot of bandwidth. If you are using a slow network, that will slow down your commits as well and the updates as well. For example, someone has pushed a changes to the remote repository. Now I need to pull those changes. Then we have to run update. If your bandwidth is pretty slow, then doing a commit and doing an update will slow down. Because of that, it will affect your development process as well. This is the major challenge what we have in centralized version control system. Second challenge is nothing but since the entire history of this particular changes is stored in the single server. If the server is inaccessible due to some power outage or maybe due to some other reasons as well, it is inaccessible. Then we can't perform any development activity. I can't update or I cannot commit. What does it mean? The development is frozen. This is another challenge what we have with centralized version control system. But when we have to use this particular centralized version control system, if I'm saying everything is complex, then why we have to use this particular CVCS? If you have a requirement where when I'm developing a software, I will write lot of binary files. Binary files are huge. It will occupy huge amount of space on the disk. In those conditions, we have to go for CVCS. Why? Because the concept is you are not storing any copy in your local system. So it will not occupy huge amount of disk space. Everything is getting stored in the centralized repository. Which means if you have this kind of concept, which are developing a binary files for your software development, definitely we have to go for CVCS instead of DVCS. Not only that, it will offer you a clean visibility. What changes the people have done, what modifications they have done, what push they have done, what changes I have to do on top of it. Everything will be straightforward and it is easy to understand. And next one is nothing but it is more of the communication will be much faster. The only thing is we need to have a network connectivity, a proper one. Then only we can do lot of commit and lot of updates into our local system or into the repository. What are the examples for this? Do you found any tools for this one? One is Apache Subversion. We can also call it as SVN. Or else we have Microsoft Team Foundational Server. We call it as TFS. That is also one of the example for centralized version control system. These are the examples. Because of this particular limitations what we have in the centralized version control system, where it will slow down for the development as well if you don't have a proper bandwidth, and it becomes difficult, right, to deliver the product on time for the client. That's the reason why we are choosing an alternative. What is it? It is called as distributed version control system. What is the advantage of it? When you compare with CVCS, your DVCS will have a copy. What does it mean? Let us say you have a developers in your team who are contributing to this particular software, which is stored in the repository server. Now, when you try to clone that particular repository, it will have a local copy of the entire history of the development. In CVCS, we don't have it. It will not store the entire history of the repository in your local system. What are the changes you want to do? Only that particular changes will get pulled. And then you will do your changes and then you will push. But here you will have the entire copy of it. Now, here the advantage is no need to consume a lot of bandwidth. Why? Because you have a local repository. First, you will commit your changes to the local repository. Then only you will push your changes to the remote. Only when you are trying to push your changes from the local repository to the remote, we have to consume the bandwidth. In all other conditions, no need to consume any bandwidth because you are trying to update your local repository, which doesn't rely on the network. Or let us say someone has pushed some changes. Now I need to pull that changes to my local repository, then it will update the file in the backend. This is the advantage what we have when you compare with CVCS. Another thing is nothing but since every developer will have a local copy, if the centralized server is inaccessible, I can get the latest code from any one of the developer and I can restore the data as part of disaster recovery. Because in the CVCS, if you don't plan the disaster recovery properly, that will affect your development. That is the reason why DVCS is suitable in this scenario. But here, if you are planning to use DVCS, we can't store large binary files. It is not at all recommended. In those conditions, we have to go for CVCS. Why? Because everybody has to clone the repository. What does it mean? Whatever the space is occupied in the remote repository, the same space will be occupied in the local repository as well. It will consume a lot of disk space. So if you don't have sufficient space, you can't do any other actions. This is one of the major challenge what we have in distributed version control system. But many of the organizations are now relying on distributed version control system compared with CVCS. If you really are planning to binary files, large binary files and all, then go for CVCS. No issues at all. Or else let's say I'm developing an infra. For that I'm writing Terraform code. Or I'm doing some configuration management. I'm writing Ansible playbooks. Or I'm developing some particular websites by using Node, React, or let us say JavaScript, HTML, CSS, or Python framework, or Go language, Java, .NET, then you prefer for distributed version control system. Choice is ours based on the functionality. Now let us try to conclude and see what are the major differences we have in distributed version control system and centralized version control system. I have written in the tabular form. Let us see the points one by one. First of all, CVCS. Manage code in a centralized server which entire history and the current state of the project is stored. What does it mean? The entire changes what you have done, that particular versioning and the history is entirely stored in the centralized server. Whereas in DVCS, it will get stored in the remote as well as in the local as well. Because you will have another copy in your local system of entire history of the revision what you have done of the files. That is the advantage what we have with DVCS. Next point is consumes heavy bandwidth with more team. Let us say if your team size is large, everybody will try to contribute to the development, right? Then those particular guys will have lot of bandwidth consumed. So if you don't have a proper bandwidth, that will affect your development as well to push the changes. In those conditions, what is an alternative we have? DVCS. It will consume less bandwidth. Why? Because most of your work is done offline. What does it mean? First, I will commit my changes to the local repository. Until I do that, I will not consume any bandwidth. The task will be done in the local system. Only when I want to push my changes to the remote repository, I will execute the command and that command will try to communicate over the network, which will consume the bandwidth. That is the reason why CVCS is called as online work and DVCS is called as offline work. Third point, no access if centralized repository server goes down. If you don't have a proper backup that you have not planned in your organization, your entire development what you have done will be lost. And if you don't take a regular backups as well, until the previous backup, what are the changes you have done, you can only restore them in a worst condition. But what about the changes you have done in the recent time? Those will be lost. So a proper backup plan has to be done in the CVCS. In the DVCS, even though the data is lost in the centralized server, I have a copy in my local system from any one of the developer. I can recover from that particular system because the entire history of the changes is also stored in that local repository. Now, what are the tools we have in CVCS? One is Apache Subversion and CVS. Whereas in DVCS, the examples are Git, Mercurial and Bazel. Now, what about CVCS? It is easy to learn for beginners because you will not face much conflicts will be there, but it is easy to understand. And whereas DVCS, we have complexity because we will use large number of commands like revert, reset, merge, fetch. There are many other things. That's the reason why for newcomers, it will seem to be a complex thing, but it is not that. We can easily understand the concept of DVCS, even from this session as well. Slow in communication and faster in communication, as we discussed. If your bandwidth is not properly used or it is not utilized, then that will affect your commits and updates. What you are trying to do on CVCS, which will slow down the communication. Whereas in DVCS, the communication is much faster from the local repository and the remote repository for a push or for a pull. When we have to go for CVCS, as I told you, when you are planning to develop a software with a large binary code, then it is preferred to use CVCS rather than DVCS. Now everybody have to plan a proper disk space in their system when you are using DVCS, but not with the case of CVCS. Now in CVCS, we will have lot of merge conflicts when you compare with DVCS. And now after this particular session, we will jump into DVCS like Git tool, and we will understand the history of the Git, why we have to go for it. That's all for this particular session. Thank you.